Do you have an object in Blender where you'd like to export and combine your materials and textures so you can use them in other softwares such as Unity and Unreal? Well, then you're in the right place. Let's jump straight into it. Before I get started, I'd like to note that this video is a guide to the add-on Quick Baker. This add-on is not free. It'll cost you $36 for your own personal license. This add-on has a deep amount of functionality, and I will try my best to cover the majority of it within this video. With that said, let's jump into the installation. Once you've downloaded the zip file, jump on over to Blender. You can drag the file into your Blender viewport, or we can do it manually. We're going to do it manually for the sake of the tutorial. Go up to Edit in the top left corner, go down to Preferences, click the Add-ons tab, hit the drop-down button in the top right corner, hit Install from Disk, and find your zip file located on your computer. Once you found your zip file, select it and hit Install from Disk. I'm not going to do this because I already have it installed. To make sure you have the add-on installed, go to the search in the add-ons, type in Quick, look for Quick Baker, and see that the check mark is checked. If you hit the drop-down, there's a couple extra settings for preferences. I would suggest just leaving it as is, but you can see here that the options are pretty self-explanatory if you understand what they are. And if you don't, then again, just leave it as it is. Now, ultimately what the Quick Baker add-on is something that will take your shader and material setups and export the textures. Typically, a reason you'd want to do this is to import your textures into other softwares so you can create the materials from there, such as Unity and Unreal. You could also do this for optimization's sake or for easier use cases within Blender itself. With that said, I have an example I'd like to show you. As mentioned, the add-on exports textures. These textures have naming schemes and have certain properties. These are the naming schemes that will be exported and the options that you will be choosing between for what you'd like to export off of your shader and material. PBR is the most common base for when you're exporting to a game, but there are more options here just in case you need them. For example, edge could be used as a mask to help you hide or show materials on the edges of your objects. I'm going to now quickly scroll past the list of texture maps just so you can get an idea of what there is to offer. I just want to throw out there as well, I won't be covering channel pack, but channel packing is creating a singular texture out of multiple different textures that carries numerous amount of data based on colors. Some shaders in even other game engines use channel packed textures. So truly, you won't need this one unless you know you need this one. So if you don't think you need it, you probably don't. Now, I'm going to continue just scrolling past the texture map options. I would like to note that I did just use a plain mesh that had a default material, and many of these maps are value maps. So between white and black, white usually being the maximum amount and black being 0, nothing of that value. So the reason you're seeing a lot of white and black is because these are value maps for these specific traits, and this object was not very detailed and didn't have much to offer, so they're solid. Now that you have a small understanding of all the texture maps provided to you within this add-on, let's get into its functionality and more of its practical use cases and utility. Okay, so if you hit N on your keyboard or come up to the arrow in the top right corner, you can open up your N panel. Here you'll find some tabs and you're looking for the tab Q Baker. This will open up the UI panels to the add-on. There's 2 other locations for these UI panels, and I will get to those later. Here I have an example of a couple of game objects with multiple materials on them, a singular UV map that's unwrapped, and principal BSDF shaders, but their nodes don't have images. Now, I want to bake these down into a singular set of images that can be used on a singular material that can be easily exported out of Blender and imported into other programs such as Unreal and Unity. This is where Quick Bake comes in handy. This is the Bake Groups tab. Think of every group as your singular texture set, and every group you make is another texture set that will be exported quickly and easily with the click of the single bake button. Now, as you saw, I was making groups very easily. You could just click the plus button to make a group. But if you have multiple game objects selected or even a singular one, you can hold down Alt, and when you hit the plus button, every single game object will have their own bake group created with their associated game object name, and their object will automatically be placed into their associated bake group. But maybe that wasn't your desired result. Maybe you wanted all these objects to be in a single bake group because you want them on a single texture set. Maybe you're atlasing. Well, there's a button for that too. That's a shift click on the plus button. Now you can see we made a whole nother bake group, and it has every single object that will bake into this texture set. Just as easy as that. Now, if you don't want to bake one of your bake groups, but you don't want to delete all the settings, you could just uncheck it. And now when you hit bake, this bake group will not be a part of that. Let me check that back on. Again, the check mark is no exception to the multiple functions. If you hit control and click the check mark, you will check on and off all the other check marks besides the selected one. Now, if you shift click, you will toggle on and off every check mark. And then again, normal clicking is the selected check mark. The same applies to the deletion button. Since I just told you what they do, I'm going to hit control, click, and keep just the singular bake group. You can also see that when I hover over these things, there is a little key that tells you all of these shortcuts. So if you ever lost or wondering what a button does, just hover over it. We can quickly duplicate bake groups if we need to copy them by quickly selecting the bake group and hitting the duplicate button right there. You can also easily move up and down your selected layers with the arrows if you have more than one layer. I will touch on high to low bakes later in the video. Here you can see the global UV map. I would recommend keeping this checked on. This is not global to all the bake groups, but it's global to all the objects within a singular bake group. Every object has UV maps attached to them. These UV maps tell the texture how to be laid out and how it should wrap around the object. Each object can have multiple UV maps, but only one can be rendered at a time. One advantage of this is you could have multiple textures and so on. Maybe you're creating awful UVs to easily tile your textures just by taking your game object like this, going into UV editing, selecting it, and just going like that. Yes, it works easily to tile your textures, but this is not bakeable. This isn't usable. So you can keep your UVs like that for your render, and then you can create another UV map that would look something more like this. And then you could select the better looking UV map, the one that's actually ready for a game, and select that. And then the rendered UV map will bake onto the selected UV map. We're just going to keep it as is for now. Additionally, there's an add UV map button. So if you don't want to go here and then select and just click the add button, you could do it right here. Put a name in and then hit OK. And now you have an extra map. Here's the material groups tab. This tab is mostly unnecessary for you to touch because almost always automatically all the materials will be added straight into this tab when you add in the object. But if it's not, so let's pretend this one didn't show up, you can manually search and add it into the list. If it's not in the list, then the material will not be baked out. Also, again, you can hit the refresh and it will automatically add in the selected objects materials. But for the most part, you won't have to worry about this tab. Onto the maps. This is where you select the type of textures you want to be exported. There's a large list of choices, and we'll go over some of the other ones later, but the most common use case ones are the PBR. These are the ones that are associated usually with other programs and your game engines. You can add these maps in manually by clicking Add Map and clicking on each map you want. There are some presets already ready for us if you're using Unity or Unreal. I'm using Unity URP Autodesk Interactive, so I'm going to click that. And as you can see, all the necessary maps were automatically inputted into our maps list. Again, the same applies to the check marks and X's here and everywhere else in the add-on. So I'm going to hit Shift X to delete everything to show you that there's also this button which will load in all the texture types found on the material that you have on your object. So when I hit this button, you'll see that all of these maps loaded in because these maps are relevant to my material. But just because these are all the relevant textures to my material doesn't mean that my game engine supports them. So I'm going to delete them again, Shift click, and I'm going to go back to the preset. You can also create your own presets by adding in the maps you want, clicking on the preset, adding in a name, and then just hitting plus, and then you'll have your own preset ready to go. Additionally, you might notice that some of the maps have this little TV button. This is the preview. Some maps, you can preview what it would look like before you bake it out. Now, it's just this cube, so there's not much to see with occlusion, so I'll give you a better example. Let me add in the edge map. Now, if I hit this, and I go into the Cycles tab, you will see a preview of the edge map. If you want to make sure you're seeing all the previews properly, I recommend being in viewport shading, the fourth orb on the right, and you have to be in cycles. Some of the previews work within the material preview, but not all. So to be completely safe, that's what I recommend. For now, I'm going to remove this, and we can continue where we left off. Every map has a properties tab. These are extra settings to individualize what's happening with your map. The suffix is the export name for the texture. This is important because a lot of programs or add-ons will look for specific names to associate your textures to. Most of the time, the default suffix built into the add-on here is good enough. Samples is the amount of time and images it gets to render that single image. Most of the time, you're only going to need one, and there's no reason to go above that. But for something like ambient occlusion, where the lighting physics of Blender matter, upping the samples to over 100 is actually quite a good idea, or else you're going to be left with a lot of noise. And on that note, there's the denoise, which you'll find on every map. This obviously tries to take the image and denoise it a little bit. You won't need this for most things, except for ambient occlusion, but there's no harm in trying it on other maps. Also, we have the custom setting, which you'll find on every map, which allows you to individualize your export settings per the texture map instead. We're not going to be doing that, so I'm going to uncheck that. Some maps have other options. As you see, I didn't go over alpha because that's an individual option per that map. I'm not going to go over every single option per map, but here I'll go over the alpha. This will bake the alpha channel and automatically apply it to the material. So if your object has any transparent parts of the texture, this will take care of that. I'm going to add a height map here, and you can see that some maps have types. And self-explanatory, it will change the type of map exported, but it's important to know that some maps have stuff like this. It'll change the entire image drastically, and it might just be what you're looking for. So if you're not finding the type of map you're looking for, make sure you check the properties. Now that we've gone over all that, I think we're ready to go into the bake settings. Here's where we finalize the settings we want to happen to all our bake groups. Oh, don't let me forget, this global check mark up here applies to all your bake groups. So if you have the check mark off, now every single bake group you have will have their own list of maps in case you want to bake different maps per bake group. Normally, you'd have this checked on because if you're working in a game engine, you're going to want the same maps for everything. And then once you have this checked on, you will only have to set up your maps once, and it will bake across all your bake groups. Now let's continue on to export. Here you'll see a lot of stuff going on. It might look a little overwhelming, but trust me, it's not. Here's where we'll input our output paths. You can input multiple output paths that you'd like to easily switch between your texture export paths. Again, there's a preset button. There's no default for the presets. You could just add in your own once you've found some settings that you really like to use often. Here we're going to hit the plus button. I pre-set up a folder in my project for where I want my textures to go, which is Cubake. So if I hit that and then I hit add again, you'll see that Cubake is now added. If I wanted to actually load that folder and the folders within it, you can click on it, as I'll show you. You can click on it, and then you can click load folder while you're inside the folder, and it will load the folder and the subfolders associated to that folder. Now, personally, I didn't want that. Additionally, a very great button that I suggest you actually check on is the subfolders button. This will create an extra folder within the folder you selected per a bake group. So if you have a lot of bake groups that you're baking at the same time, this is going to be a lifesaver for organization. Since this is checked on, now if I hit bake, we're going to get a folder within the Cubake folder called box, and that folder will hold all of the map textures that we exported. Next, we have size, which is just your pixel resolution. If you hit custom, you could do a different width and height. Normally, you're just going to want a square, and I'm going to go with 1K. Next, we have the image format, which again, normally I'm going to want PNG because that also supports transparency. Then we have anti-aliasing, which will try to smooth out some rough pixel edges. We have color management, which you can see here is the type of color management, well, happening in Blender. I was told that this affects every single map in the baking process, but personally, I haven't seen a difference between color management options. It's good to note just in case. Then you can select the color depth you want, 8-bit or 16-bit. Here's the compression. If you set it to 0, you'll have no compression whatsoever. If you set it to 100, you'll have 100% lossless compression, which will save you on data size, but it will add more time to your bakes. I'm going to put that back to 15. Margin type is how your textures will be margined compared to your selected UV maps. Margin size is the distance that it will be doing between your selected UV maps. Processes, I'm not entirely sure what this is, but it's recommended that you keep a lower number if you're baking 4K or higher, and since the default is 1, I would just keep it at that. It works just fine. And these are your post-bake settings. So once your bake has completed, these things will take action. Having this checked on will create a material for you to apply within Blender. Duplicate object will duplicate the existing object and apply the created material if it's baked out to the object. Join objects will turn all the objects within the singular bake group object list and join them together into a singular object. This can only happen if you duplicate the object. It will not do this for the original objects. And hide object only works if you duplicate objects as well, which will hide the original object in place of the newly duplicated object. I'm going to keep these all checked on except for join objects. Now we can just hit bake. Now that our bake has finished, you might think that nothing has changed, but this is actually our baked object. The original object is now hidden, as you can see here. This is the original object, and you can almost not tell a difference. If we click on this object and we go to our UV editing, you can see now though that our textures are baked out, ready to go, and are on a single texture sheet. If I open up that export directory that I was talking about, which you can quickly access just by clicking the folder icon, you can see now we have a folder named box, which has all the image maps that we selected to export. And just like that, this object is now game ready. Let's talk about a few of the other areas of this add-on. If you jump into edit mode on an object, you'll see that our Baker tabs have turned into a Vertex Color tab. Here within the second viewport shading option, you can see we can actually color the individual vertices just by selecting the vertices we want and then clicking the color button underneath the color. We can also select and have a custom color and apply it, and if you hit apply when nothing is selected, it will apply it to the entire object. This is a good way to help visualize your models to others and communicate things. But additionally, if you just want to do some low poly art styling, you can color them like this, and there's a map in the Baker tool that lets you export these as your color map, which is really nifty. Now, I'm going to go back to a box that's not baked. So let's click on the box above this and jump into the shading tab. Here in the shading area, there's actually an N panel as well. So if you hit N on the keyboard or the arrow in the top right corner, you'll open up another panel. And here you can see there's also another Q Baker, but we have a different UI here. I'm going to jump into the material preview so we can see the boxes. And here you can see, again, unlike our baked out material where you could see every individual texture here now, this is just one big node that does not have individual texture maps, which is not usable for our game. We have two different baking tools here. One is a node bake. Node bake will bake stuff out of the individual selected node. We can choose a folder to export to, and we can add subfolders, and we can load the entire folder list just like before. Batch name is the naming scheme. So you could see it's the node type, the size of it, and the socket type that will be exported. We could choose the size of the image, the margin type, the margin size, the samples, the UV map, and the socket is only the output sockets. And my node here has a lot of output sockets. There's even some that are hidden down below. And that's why you see so many. You probably won't see this many options. You can choose an individual output socket, or you can choose all the sockets to be baked out at once. I'm going to choose an individual socket, and I'm just going to bake out the base color. And when I hit bake, you'll see now we already have our base color baked out, ready to go. If we now go to our folder, you'll find that it is exported and ready to be used. I'm going to delete that. And now we have material bake. So if you just want to bake the material, which I think is more useful if you're kind of making a material on just a flat plane to be used on multiple game objects, you can do that in here. Just add the material you want to bake, which you can search for here, or you could just click this button, load in all the materials on the selected game object. And if you hit shift load, you'll load in all the materials in your project. So I'm going to load in the materials on the selected game object. Again, you get the arrows. This time we have a global maps checkbox. This isn't based on bake groups. It's based on every single material. You have a presets here that you can create, but there is no basic presets. If you click the refresh button, it will load in all the inputs. And if you click the refresh button with the shift button, it will load in all the inputs, ignoring the values in the BSDF node. Again, I'm just going to add in the Unity ones. Every map, again, has their own properties, just like before. The global button for the bake, which works for the other UI as well, which I failed to mention, will allow you to select different bake options per selected bake group or material, depending on what UI you're in. We're probably going to want the same settings across all our things, so I'm going to keep it on. We're going to add in our export folder, and we're going to hit bake. We're going to add the subfolders, and we're going to hit bake. And now you'll see we're going to have two subfolders for each material, which will have all the textures associated with that material. Easy peasy. Now let's jump into some samples. Now you might just think I have another white cube, which I do, but a really cool map within the map list here is the material ID. You can export the vertex colors. This is a pretty good, easy way to do some low poly texturing. If you go into edit mode while selecting the object and go into the solid shading, you can see suddenly things that typically don't have color have some color. This is vertex coloring. This can be a good way to show or display areas to coworkers that they might need to see. But now it can be used as kind of a pretty decent texturing system. Just click on your face that you want to color and then click on the color and then boom. And now you're not limited to just these colors. You can change the colors here or just the general main color and then you can apply it. And as you just saw, if you have nothing selected and you hit apply, it would apply it to the entire object. Now I'm just going to color some random spots here just so you can get an idea of how the bake actually works. Okay, now that I colored them, I just want to make sure you understand this vertex color list is a part of the add-on. It's the same tab. It just replaces the bake tools when you go into edit mode. So let's now tab back out of edit mode and make sure you add this map. Go to add map. It's under mesh material ID. And then once you have that selected, you want to go down to properties and you wanted to go to type vertex color. And now you're ready to bake just like you bake your other objects. Just make sure it's selected. Now you'll see if I go back to the viewport shading, there's an object here that is ready to go with all these pretty colors. If I hit shading, you'll see that there's a new texture map, which is the texture map we just baked out, and it's connected to the color node. My image previews sometimes glitch out a little bit. That's why it's not loading, but it should. So I'm just going to type it in real quick so you can see it. There you go. And it just made a texture with all the colors we had selected following our UV map. Isn't that great? Next on our list is height maps, specifically for terrain. So I made this quick little terrain that I just sculpted with a couple of sculpt brushes. I have this unwrapped to cover the entire UV square. As you can see, I have the height map set to displacement, and you can invert it, but this would give you inverted results when you go to use it. These height maps can actually be used on objects or even used for Unity terrains. So this could be your Unity terrain. And now that we have this and we added this, again, it's just as easy. You just hit bake. We have our height map, and you can see that it's exported again to our folder. I have terrain and there's the height map. That's pretty nice if I'd say so myself. On to our next use case. Surprisingly again, it's a height map. Now, if you wanted to create normal maps or trim sheets so you can create more detailed designs on your objects without adding any extra actual geometry, you need normal maps. But sometimes you can't find all the ones you need online. So by using a height map, you can create your own normal maps easily. Just grab a plane, UV unwrap it to cover the whole square again, and create the map you want. And as you can see from above, this is the type of map you'd export. I'll save you time, and I'm not going to bake this one this time. You get the idea from this picture. But just so you know how to set it up, here's my bake group for this normal map. I have my normal map object in here, and then down here again I have height map, which may confuse you, but the type is normal, and that's the only difference. On to the next. We're finally on to high to low. I mentioned earlier that I was going to touch back on this. Well, here we are. High to low is a way of taking a high poly mesh detail that you might have sculpted and to take those details and turn those sculpted details into a texture. So you can put it on a low poly object and make that object have the illusion of looking like the high poly object that you might have sculpted or modeled. You'll notice that our bake groups tab has kind of changed a little bit once we click this checkbox. We now have a section called groups, which works very similarly to our bake groups, but now it's a sub-level of our individual bake group. These groups are collections of our high and low poly assets. So you could bake multiple objects in here, but each group in here should have a high poly and a low poly asset so it can bake onto it. As you can see in our pillow group that I have here, my high poly asset is here and my low poly asset is here under low poly and high poly. These symbols should be pretty self-explanatory to you by now. By clicking the plus button, you can search, and by clicking the refresh button, you can add your selected objects. Now, let me show you quickly what the objects I actually have are. So here's my high poly pillow. You can see it has all these nice little wrinkles around it and details on the surface. But if I click on it, you can see it's 98,000 tries, which is completely unusable for a game. And if I hit tab, you can see what a mess this is. But now I'm going to show you my low poly object, which you can see has no detail whatsoever. Actually rather ugly. But if I click on it, you can see it's only 440 tries. And if I show you the geometry, that's a lot better. So how do we do it? Well, as I stated, you gotta put your high poly mesh in the high poly section, your low poly mesh in the low poly section. I suggest using auto cage. If you don't want to though, you can create an object to reference as the cage, but we're gonna use auto cage. So check that box and go down to cage extrusion. And when you start moving the extrusion, you'll see the cage. This is our cage, which is really neat. Now, you don't need it to be super huge. You just want it to be big enough to cover everything that could be leaking out of it. You can see over here and over here, you'll see that it's leaking out of the cage. But if I just bump it up just a little bit, they're no longer leaking out of the cage. And that's about all we want. Ray distance, most of the time you could keep it at 0, which makes the ray distance unlimited. But if you're having some issues, try turning the ray distance up. It's the distance that the cage can see, but we're gonna keep it on 0. I have the same Unity map selected, but the primary map that matters here is the normal map. This is going to be our detail that's going to get transferred. And no, not the height normal map, the PBR normal map. I'm not going to save you the time this one around, and I'm going to bake it so you can see it work in action. Now that the bake is complete, I can hide the low poly and high poly object, and you can see that we have a pillow with the details on it and the low poly geometry. Just amazing. I want to note too, if you have create material on and duplicate object on either of them, when you hit bake again, it will remember the naming schemes as long as your objects names all stay the same, and it will just replace them. So duplicate object will not duplicate another object if there's already a duplicated object in the scene, and create material will override the textures in that material. It will not create you a new material on top of the already newly created material, thankfully. On to the next. Have you ever wanted a texture that was literally just the wireframe of your object? Well, now you can have it. Go to Add Maps, go down to the mesh category and go to wireframe. Once you have it added, you're probably going to want to hit all UVs and modify so you can get the proper wire mesh of your object. And then just hit bake. And now that it's baked, you can see that we have a wireframe texture of our mesh. It's just cool, but it's also useful for technical showcasing or even using it for masking. Maybe you'd want your model to have a wireframe emission. That'd be really cool. Now, I have to admit, I did some editing magic here. Not all the maps will automatically be applied to your base color. And that's a good thing. You don't really want that, but I'm putting all these maps on the base colors so you can visualize them in the shading. A lot of maps will come like this, but if you just want to see them and visualize them, just grab the color node and drag it to your base color. On to the next. I mentioned this one earlier, Ambient Occlusion. This one I recommend you actually increase the sample count. So let's add that. The reason is because it uses cycles rendering, and you can see in cycles there's noise. All the dots, that's noise. So it's important to make sure you give plenty full of samples. So I'm gonna put 100 samples and I'm gonna hit denoise, and now I'm gonna bake it out. Again, I put the texture on the base color so you can visualize it. You can see now that our cube has shadows and shading where it's needed, and all the cracks and crevices. And the cube might look pretty clean, but as you can see, there's still noise if I scroll in. All these dots. Increasing your samples will help reduce this and turning on denoise. So I guess maybe I could have used some more samples. My last sample for this menu of the add-on is this cube. You might be confused because it's just a solid color and I have a base color map in here. But what I'm here to show you is UDIMs. If I go over to UV editing, you can see that I have these. You can see that I have the UV unwrap go outside the actual tile. By doing this, we're going to automatically create a packed UDIM texture. Let me show you an example. Now that it's baked, you can see once I go over to UV editing that we have 3 UV tiles. And if we go over to our file, you can see that we actually have 3 different images for our singular mesh. I personally don't use UDIMs, but if you're interested, there's plenty of tutorials online to teach you more about the UDIM workflow. These do work in game engines. Typically though, sometimes you're gonna need a special shader. And that's it for the Quick Baker add-on. This is an extremely powerful baking add-on. And I'd also like to add, I've been a user of the notorious Simple Bake add-on for years, and I think I'm finally going to make the switch over to Quick Bake. There's countless more features available here. It's more intuitive to easily get things going and export it into my projects. Visualizing for the cage is wonderful, and I haven't had a single crash with this add-on so far. Meanwhile, Simple Bake, I've crashed almost every other time I use it. I always feel like I'm stepping on shells when I use Simple Bake. The only thing that I really wish that this add-on will have, and maybe it may and hopefully it will come in future updates, is the auto map UV generator that Simple Bake has. Outside of that, I'm making the switch, and maybe you will too, or maybe you'll choose this to be your first and primary bake add-on from the get-go. But that's it. That's Quick Bake. I have to say I was given this add-on for free to help create this in-depth guide for you guys, and I will be receiving a small commission of the sales for a limited time after this video goes up. So if you happen to purchase Quick Baker shortly after this video has been uploaded, thank you. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the tool. If you want to see more videos from me, such as tutorials or guides of other add-ons, just let me know. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.